The summer of 1863 was a momentous period in the Civil War. Two military turning points occurred in the month of July: the Battle of Gettysburg and the Fall of Vicksburg. It was also a turning point, of sorts, in a different kind of war being fought against Copperhead guerrillas, who were starting to be taken very seriously by military officials.
To Captain John Green, Assistant Adjutant General for Ohio. I have the honor to request that at least 300 men may be detailed to report to me for duty in Holmes County, Ohio, where a large force of insurgents, estimated at 700 to 900, are collected together. I desire to use the troops in making arrests of parties who have obstructed the enforcement of the Enrollment Act. Your obedient servant, Colonel Edward A. Parrott, Assistant Provost Marshal General.
The situation in Holmes County had escalated from bad to worse. Earlier that month, a group of armed men had badly beaten a military draft enrollment officer. A deputy provost marshal had arrested the assailants, but then a mob of 70 armed men forced the jailer to release them. In the days that followed, authorities learned that hundreds of armed men had gathered at an area farm, determined to violently resist any future attempts to register local men for the draft. According to reports, they even had a small cannon. Colonel William Wallace was given a force of over 400 men to address the situation, along with a proclamation from Ohio Governor David Todd, ordering the mob to disperse immediately and to end their obstruction of the enrollment process. Wallace was instructed, quote, "Should you be compelled to use force to carry out your instructions, act promptly and with energy."
I have the honor to submit my report of the expedition under my command for the purpose of suppressing an insurrection in Holmes County, Ohio. When about 1.5 miles from Napoleon, I was fired on from behind a number of stone piles. The fire was promptly returned, and about 50 insurgents sprang from the ground and fled. Several were overtaken and captured. 3 were wounded, and 2 were said to be killed.
In the aftermath of the skirmish, Colonel Wallace negotiated with a group of local anti-war Democrats, led by a former U.S. Congressman named Daniel Ledbetter. Ledbetter convinced the insurgents to surrender to Union forces. All told, over 40 people were indicted for their involvement in the rebellion.
I feel satisfied that the object of the expedition has been accomplished, that no further resistance to the execution of the laws will be attempted in Holmes County, and that the slight shedding of blood will be a warning to all evil-disposed persons that any further attempt to resist the officers of the government in the execution of the law will be met with speedy and sure punishment. Your obedient servant, Colonel William Wallace.
This is what things had come to in the summer of 1863. Thousands of badly needed soldiers had to be taken from the front lines and sent to places like Holmes County, Ohio, and even New York City, to suppress armed insurrections by Copperhead Democrats, angry about the draft, about the Emancipation Proclamation, and the recent addition of black soldiers to the Union Army. This is the Copperhead Conspiracy. I'm Dan Getteman. One thing that greatly aided military officials in putting down the Holmes County Rebellion was the fact that the Army had placed a spy in the ranks of the insurrectionists. This wasn't a new development in American military history. Spies had been used in most American wars going back to the Revolutionary War. What was different here was that the Union Army was spying on its own citizens, not the Confederates. In 1863, The War Department authorized the Union Army's provost marshals in each state to hire special officers to investigate possible draft resistance activities. These men often went undercover, trying to get themselves accepted as a member of Copperhead groups. And no one did this with greater success than a Kentuckian named Felix Stidger.
Felix Stidger is the preeminent infiltrator of the secret societies of the Northwest.
Patrick Lewis is the president of the Filson Historical Society in Louisville and author of For Slavery and Union.
He's able to get in and be a double agent that infiltrates these groups and be in contact with state and federal military and civil authorities to really sort of understand the extent of these networks, to understand, when and where they're going to be contacted by Confederate agents, and to direct them to disrupting those activities. I mean, he is a classic spy. This is James Bond stuff happening in the 1860s in cities across the Midwest. And he travels really extensively and kind of becomes an expert in building trust, getting inside these organizations, and bringing them down from the inside.
Stidger had served in the Union Army as a clerk in the headquarters of Major General Rosecrans. When his mother became gravely ill, Stidger sought a discharge from the Army to care for her back in Kentucky. After her death, he looked for ways that he could again help the war effort, serving as an informant to the Provost Marshal General of Kentucky. During one visit to the Provost Marshal's office in April 1864, he learned of a request from the military commander of Indiana, Brigadier General Henry Carrington, who was looking for someone in Kentucky to infiltrate a newly formed secret society, previously called the Order of American Knights, and now called the Sons of Liberty. Stidger readily agreed.
Stidger is told to go up into Indiana and see what you can find out.
Stephen Town is an archivist at Indiana University, Indianapolis, and author of Surveillance and Spies in the Civil War.
And to make a long story short, Stidger stumbles into the middle of the organized conspiracy in Indiana. He just sort of had a knack of making himself seem benign to these conspirators, and they unburdened their secrets to him. And so he gets on the inside of this Sons of Liberty conspiracy almost from the get-go. And he gets a letter of introduction from one of the leading conspirators in Indiana, a guy named William Bowles, to the leader of the conspiracy in Kentucky.
From Treason History, the published memoirs of Felix Stidger. Bowles was anxious that I should make the acquaintance of Joshua Bullitt, Grand Commander of the Sons of Liberty in Kentucky. Before the time of this visit to Bowles, I did not know of Bullitt's connection with the order, only that Bullitt was Chief Justice of the Appellate Court of the state of Kentucky. I met Grand Commander Bullitt in Louisville, where he talked with me about my service in the Army, and stated that he would like to have me accept the appointment and perform the duties of Grand Secretary of the Order of the Sons of Liberty for the state of Kentucky. I accepted his offer of the appointment and expressed my readiness to begin the active duties of the office at any time.
Stidger so impressed Judge Bullitt that he started to assign him increasingly important tasks. One of the first things he did was to send him back to Indiana with a letter of introduction to the Grand Commander of the Sons of Liberty in Indiana, Harrison Dodd.
To Mr. Harrison H. Dodd, Dear Sir, my friend, Mr. Felix Stidger, is going to Indianapolis on business, in which I think it probable that you can aid him. He is entirely reliable, and any aid you can give him will confer a favor on your friend, Joshua F. Bullitt.
Harrison Dodd is a sort of up-and-coming printer in the city of Indianapolis.
Robert Churchill is a professor of history at the University of Hartford and author of to shake their guns in the tyrant's face.
He wants to be one of the party's preeminent sort of traveling speakers, who goes out and rallies the faithful at county meetings and local meetings. But he's sort of relegated to the second string. He's sort of, he's a bourgeois man on the make, and he is ambitious, and he begins to see the idea of creating this fraternal organization, the Sons of Liberty, with himself at the head of it as his sort of way of, pulling what he believes to be his full weight within the party. And he gets a number of the leaders of the Democratic Party in Indiana involved in this.
Another important component of the Indiana Sons of Liberty were small farmers, many originally from the South, who joined mutual protection societies to defend themselves against what they saw as unconstitutional overreach by the Republicans, both in Indiana and in Washington.
Harrison Dodd has his eyes on these mutual protection associations as a way of giving the organization essentially a rural rank and file, and what he hopes will be sort of a rural quasi-militia that will allow it to realize, this vision of the Northwest Confederacy. The problem is that while leading Democrats who sort of involve themselves in this organization absolutely are on board with the purpose of using it as a way of politically organizing this faction of the party, they're not as aware of Dodd's ambitions for the Northwestern Confederacy, and they're not nearly as on board with them, and they're not as aware of what he intends in terms of bringing sort of this more radical rural rank and file into the organization.
In February 1864, Harrison Dodd gave a speech to the Grand Council of Indiana's Sons of Liberty, in which he laid out the organization's mission.
We are organized for a high and noble purpose: the erection and consecration of temples to the service of true republicanism, requiring patience, fortitude, patriotism, and self-sacrificing disposition from one and all, and may require us to hazard life itself. It shall restore to this great people their fireside rights, a pure elective franchise, and an untrammeled judiciary, when fanatical usurpers and would-be tyrants and dictators are swept away with the rubbish that has been thrown to the surface in these extraordinary times. The liberation of 4 million blacks and putting them upon an equality with whites is a scheme which can only bring its authors to shame.
In the spring and summer of 1864, Harrison Dodd's plans for some kind of uprising, some kind of, sort of movement towards the Northwestern Confederacy get more grandiose, and they also get sort of a major influx of funds. Somehow or other, Harrison Dodd sort of falls in with a bunch of Confederate agents who have come down from Canada, and Dodd meets with these guys and discusses his ideas with them, and he comes away from that meeting not only with a more elaborate plan, but also with the funds to back it up. These Confederates have basically been given substantial funds by the Confederate government to try to meddle in Northern politics, and Dodd turns out to be sort of the perfect guy for them to sort of make that happen. So Dodd comes back to Indiana with a plan that is now much more grandiose. And the plan is that the Sons of Liberty will gather its forces, and that first thing it's going to do is that it is going to release the prisoners from the prisoner of war camps that are placed in Indianapolis and in Chicago, and also at Rock Island in Illinois. And then, of course, Chicago and Indianapolis also hold the state arsenals. You put those guns together with fully trained Confederate soldiers and the forces of the Sons of Liberty, and now you essentially have a pro-Southern army sitting in the middle of the Midwest. That army is then going to essentially capture the governments of Indiana and Illinois and declare that those states are then going to withdraw from the Union, their governments having been captured by what is in effect a pro-Confederate army.
From his vantage point as secretary of the Sons of Liberty's Kentucky branch, Felix Stidger was now in a position to know everything that was going on in this secret organization, which had tens of thousands of members in Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio, as well as allies in other states. Again, historian Stephen Town.
And he starts to write reports to the military commander in Kentucky about what he's hearing, what he's learning, also reporting in parallel, sending reports up to General Carrington in Indianapolis. These reports tell military commanders in Kentucky and Indiana about what the conspirators are planning, who the leaders are, what they're thinking about. And then he starts hearing about their plans for uprisings. And it really boils down to an uprising that's supposed to take place in the middle of August.
When Union spy Felix Stidger passed on this information to his military superiors, they decided it was time to put a stop to it, starting with the arrest of the leader of the Kentucky Sons of Liberty, Joshua Bullitt. On July 30th, 1864, they arrested Bullitt and found that he was carrying a small fortune to fund the operation in Kentucky, with checks totaling $10,000 and another $5,000 in gold bars. All told, 25 men were arrested in Kentucky, including a prominent physician, the Louisville fire chief, and the Jefferson County jailer. These arrests were troubling enough for Harrison Dodd and the other Sons of Liberty leaders to alter the timetable for their insurrection. The new plan was for it to coincide with the Democratic Convention in Chicago, which would take place the last week of August. Worried that the threat of an uprising was still potent, Army officials began negotiating with the Midwestern governors to make even more arrests. But problems quickly emerged on that front.
For example, Richard Yates, the governor of Illinois, he was afraid that if the army arrested the Illinois conspirators, that the rank and file would rise up and there weren't enough troops in Illinois to put down the uprising. So he told military commanders not to arrest the conspirators. The same thing in Ohio. Governor John Breaux didn't want the conspirators in Ohio arrested. Governor Morton in Indiana was okay with it, and he wanted to go ahead and arrest the conspirators in Indiana. And that eventually happened.
On the morning of August 20th, soldiers broke into Harrison Dodd's printing offices and seized nearly 400 revolvers and 135,000 rounds of ammunition, as well as letters and other documents pertaining to the Sons of Liberty, which added to the trove of printed information already amassed by Felix Stidger. They also arrested 3 of Dodd's business partners, including the treasurer of the Indiana Sons of Liberty. But Dodd himself escaped capture. Indiana Governor Morton quickly realized the political value of the Sons of Liberty files that had been found over the previous month, especially in an election year.
He was a smart politician, and he knew that these Democratic politicians, his opponents, were implicated in conspiracy, in disloyalty, in short, in treason. And they were in it up to their ears. And he wanted to use this publicly. He wanted exposés. He wanted this to be splashed on the newspapers. And so he went over the heads of the local generals and went to the War Department in Washington, D.C., and he went directly to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and he badgered him for weeks in the summer of 1864, saying, I've got this information. It's dynamite stuff. I want to use it for political purposes. And finally, after weeks of badgering Stanton agreed to this. And so Morton has his mouthpiece, the Indianapolis Daily Journal, publish a long, huge expose quoting a report from early June of 1864 written by U.S. Army General Henry Carrington with all kinds of documents that Stidger had smuggled out of Sons of Liberty headquarters.
I place in your hands a partial outline of the nature, work, and extent of a disloyal society now operating in the state of Indiana under the name of the Sons of Liberty. It is both civil and military in nature. It declares principles for adoption and dissemination that are hostile to the United States. It assumes to organize armies for actual service in support of those principles, treating the United States government as their enemy and that of the rebellion as their friend. It is secret and oath-bound and holds revolution against the present government as not only a right, but a duty.
This expose, which was published at the end of July, created a huge furor. It was astonishing stuff, implicating Democrats in conspiracy, in collaboration with Confederate agents. And all kinds of documentation was published in these newspaper reports. Of course, part of this was they wanted to head off what they knew was coming, which were these attempts to attack the POW camps. The reason why is because there were very, very few troops stationed in these northern communities. That's a very important thing. So Morton is trying to forestall an uprising by exposing the conspirators and then essentially shaming them into submission. And in part, he succeeds. And that's part of the reason why some of these planned uprisings were postponed, but only temporarily.
The arrests of Joshua Bullitt and several other Sons of Liberty leaders, coupled with the newspaper exposés, should have been a death blow to the Copperhead movement. However, Harrison Dodd, the Indiana Grand Commander, was still very much at large, and with the help of Confederate agents and his brothers in the Sons of Liberty, he made it up to Canada, where Clement Vallandigham, now the Sons of Liberty's supreme commander, was living in exile along with dozens of Confederate soldiers who had escaped from northern prisons. But what on earth were all these exiled Copperheads and escaped Confederates doing in Canada, which was neutral during the Civil War?
The Canadian newspapers were largely in favor of the Confederates, and they denounced Lincoln as, quote, the mad, blood-stained despot at Washington.
That's next time on the Copperhead Conspiracy. The Copperhead Conspiracy is a production of Reckoning, Inc., with funding and scholarly assistance from Ohio Humanities. It was produced and narrated by me, Dan Getteman. Our historical consultant was Dr. Stephen Rockenbach. Voice actors were Alec Voles and Barrett Cooper. Our theme music was composed by Ja'Cory Arthur, with other music licensed from Blue Dot Sessions. Special thanks to Nina Ellis, Louisville Public Media, and to Loretta Williams for editorial guidance. Major support for this series was provided by Archon Construction. Additional support from Jay and Susan Giles, Doreen Yuha Sauer, Lopa Mehrotra, and Douglas and Marissa Brown. Many thanks to Patrick Lewis and Robert Churchill, whose interviews were heard in this episode. Special thanks to Stephen Town, also heard in this episode, whose book Surveillance and Spies in the Civil War was a key resource for this series, and who graciously provided other documents and guidance that aided in its production. If you would like to support our nonprofit organization and unlock bonus episodes of this series, you can do so at patreon.com/reckoningradio. Our first bonus episode explains all the key events in American history that led to the Civil War. You can access that and more at patreon.com/reckoningradio. For transcripts, a bibliography, and other content related to this series, please visit our website at copperheadconspiracy.org. That's copperheadconspiracy.org. And if you haven't already done so, please leave a review of this series on whatever platform you use to hear it. It will really help other listeners to find this podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Please join us next time for another episode of the Copperhead Conspiracy.